Hey guys, tonight we're talking about life expectancy in the Middle Ages, a time when simply waking up in the morning counted as a personal achievement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval history had a most misunderstood statistic award, it would go without competition to this sentence. People in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30. You hear this line repeated so often that it has basically achieved folklore status. It gets quoted confidently, dramatically, and almost always incorrectly, usually by someone who has never stopped to ask what an average actually is. Because this number does not mean medieval adults woke up on their 30th birthday, looked in the mirror, and said, "Ah, yes, the time has come," before gently collapsing into the nearest ditch. What it actually means is that childhood was an obstacle course designed by fate on a bad day. Life expectancy is an average, not a countdown timer, and medieval averages were absolutely demolished by infant and child mortality, when huge numbers of children die very young, and in the Middle Ages they did. The math becomes deeply unhelpful. The average sinks, even if the adults who survive go on to live fairly long, stubborn lives. You can imagine a village where half the children never reach adulthood. The survivors might live into their 50s or 60s, long enough to complain about their joints, criticize the youth, and insist things were better back in their day. But the average still looks grim because the early deaths pull the number down like an anchor tied to a sinking boat. This is why medieval life expectancy looks horrifying on paper. Birth itself was risky. Infancy was dangerous. Childhood was a long series of chances to get unlucky. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no germ theory, and no one saying, "Maybe don't drink that." A fever was not a minor inconvenience. It was a negotiation. A small cut was not an annoyance. It was a potential career-ending injury for your entire life. The medieval world was not filled with weak adults. It was filled with adults who had already survived the hardest part. Those who made it past childhood were not fragile. They were battle-tested. So that famous number does tell you something important, just not what people think. It tells you the Middle Ages were not a world of short lives. They were a world where survival was front-loaded, uneven, and deeply unfair, which, frankly, is a very medieval way to do statistics. The number itself is technically accurate, but it flattens wildly different experiences into something tidy and misleading. When you look at skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries, you find evidence of people who lived into their 60s and 70s. You find grandparents. You find elders who were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything that went wrong, which is still how old age works today. These people existed. They were not myths, but their presence in the data gets swallowed by the sheer volume of child deaths. Scholars have long understood this distinction, but it rarely makes it into casual conversation. The dramatic version, "everyone died at 30," is simpler, more shocking, and easier to remember. What makes this especially frustrating is how it warps modern perception of medieval life. You start imagining a society where no one had experience, where wisdom could not accumulate, where every generation started from scratch. That was not reality. Medieval society had continuity. It had memory. It had people who remembered past famines, past wars, and past mistakes. Those people shaped communities, passed down knowledge, and maintained traditions. You cannot do that if everyone dies young. The misunderstanding also obscures the real tragedy. The problem was not that medieval people were biologically incapable of living long lives. The problem was that too many never got the chance to try. Childhood mortality was the silent catastrophe that shaped everything else. Parents knew the odds. They lived with constant uncertainty. They celebrated milestones carefully, cautiously, as if joy itself might attract bad luck. This was not because they loved their children less. It was because they had learned that optimism needed limits. So when you hear that medieval people lived to 30, what you are really hearing is this. Survival was a filter. It was harsh, unforgiving, and applied earliest to the most vulnerable. Those who passed through it often lived lives that looked surprisingly familiar, long enough to see their own children grow, long enough to accumulate regrets and wisdom in equal measure, long enough to become the old person muttering about how things used to be better. The average hides all of that. It compresses grief, endurance, and resilience into a single number and pretends it tells the whole story. It does not. It never has. If medieval life expectancy was a numbers problem, birth was where the math immediately tried to kill you. Being born in the Middle Ages was not a gentle entrance into the world. It was a high-risk event involving pain, uncertainty, and a complete lack of anyone who actually knew what they were doing. Childbirth was dangerous for everyone involved. Mothers faced labor without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and without the comforting presence of someone who understood infections. Midwives relied on experience, prayer, and a collection of herbal remedies that ranged from helpful to, "This might make things worse, but we are committed now." There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no emergency surgery, no sterile instruments. If complications arose, the solution was often spiritual encouragement and hoping the situation respected good intentions. And the baby entered a world that immediately tested its commitment to staying alive. Exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and disease began almost instantly. Even the first few days were critical. Many infants did not survive long enough to be formally named, not because parents did not care, but because naming someone who might not survive the week was emotionally expensive. Birth records from the Middle Ages reflect this harsh reality. Baptisms were sometimes rushed, not out of panic, but out of experience. People knew the odds. They lived with them. Mothers who survived childbirth were not automatically safe either. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications could end lives days later, long after the baby had arrived, and everyone thought the danger had passed. Survival required luck layered on top of resilience. What makes this especially grim is repetition. Women did not face this risk once. They faced it again and again. Multiple pregnancies were common. Each one was another roll of the dice, another conversation with fate that no one asked to have. And yet people kept having children. not because they were careless, but because survival depended on it. High mortality required high birth rates. Families adapted, even when adaptation meant living with constant uncertainty. Medieval people did not assume birth meant life. They hoped for it carefully, quietly, and with the emotional restraint of people who had learned that optimism needed limits. If you survived birth, congratulations, you had officially cleared the tutorial. Unfortunately, the real game started immediately afterward, and it was significantly harder. Childhood was not a protected, innocent phase of life. It was the most statistically dangerous period you would ever experience, and it showed absolutely no mercy. Medieval children faced dangers everywhere. Disease was constant. Hygiene existed, but without any understanding of why it mattered. Germs were invisible, mysterious, and apparently very committed to their work. A simple fever could spiral into something fatal, and no one knew when it crossed that line. Doctors did not measure symptoms, they guessed confidently. Accidents were another favorite threat. Children worked early. They played near animals, tools, open fires, rivers, wells, and carts with no safety standards whatsoever. Falling into something was not a rare mishap. It was a common childhood milestone, and without modern medical care, injuries that seem minor today could quietly end a life. Nutrition did not help. Many children lived on diets heavy in grains and light in variety. In good years, this was manageable. In bad years, it weakened bodies and lowered resistance to illness. Hunger made everything worse, including survival. Parents knew this. They watched children grow with a mixture of love and restraint. Every milestone was celebrated quietly, cautiously, as if joy itself might attract bad luck. The longer a child lived, the better their chances became. But no one ever fully relaxed. This is where modern misunderstandings begin. You might imagine medieval childhood as emotionally cold. It was not. It was emotionally careful. Loving deeply while expecting loss was a survival strategy. People learned to hope in measured doses. And yet, despite everything, many children did survive. Those who made it past the most dangerous early years grew stronger, tougher, and remarkably resilient. By adolescence, survival odds improved significantly. At that point, you had beaten the hardest level without even realizing it. There is a stubborn myth that medieval parents did not love their children because so many of them died. The logic usually goes like this. If loss was common, attachment must have been weak. This idea sounds neat, emotionally tidy, and completely wrong. Medieval parents loved their children intensely. You know this from letters, wills, prayers, church records, and graves. Parents mourned deeply. They grieved publicly and privately. They wrote about their children. They paid for memorials when they could afford them. They did not shrug and move on like emotionally distant robots made of straw and theology. What medieval parents practiced was not emotional detachment. It was emotional management. When death is common, you do not stop loving. You stop assuming. You learn to love while holding back just enough to survive the grief if the worst happens. This was not coldness. It was experience. Parents celebrated milestones carefully. A child's first year mattered. Reaching early childhood mattered. Surviving winter mattered. Each stage unlocked a little more relief. a little more hope. Naming ceremonies were sometimes delayed, not because parents were indifferent, but because naming someone who might not survive the month was emotionally expensive. It was grief budgeting. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not short because people did not value children. It was short because the world did not care. If you reached adulthood, you did not just grow up, you earned it. Scholars remain uncertain about the exact mortality rates for different age groups, but the pattern is clear across archaeological and documentary evidence. The first 5 years were the most dangerous. After that, the curve began to flatten. Survival became less random and more about resilience, environment, and sheer stubbornness. Here's the plot twist most people never hear. If you survived childhood in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy quietly improved dramatically, not magically. This was still the Middle Ages, but enough to completely reframe that infamous people only lived to 30 line. Once you made it past infancy, early childhood, and adolescence, you had already cleared the most dangerous phase of medieval life. At that point, you were no longer constantly rolling the dice against nature. You were still playing the game, but the odds had stopped being openly hostile. Many medieval adults lived into their 50s. Quite a few reached their 60s. Some even reached their 70s, at which point the village collectively decided you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. Old age was not common, but it absolutely existed, and when it did, it came with authority. Elders were respected, consulted, and occasionally blamed for everything that went wrong, which is still how old age works today. This is where modern misunderstandings really collapse. Medieval society was not a place where everyone died young. It was a place where many died young, and the survivors often lived surprisingly long lives. Life expectancy statistics hide that distinction, flattening complex human experiences into a single misleading number. Once adulthood was reached, people settled into rhythms. They worked, married, raised families, complained about aches, and developed strong opinions about how lazy the younger generation had become. In other words, adulthood looked familiar, just with fewer safety nets and more medieval consequences. This does not mean life suddenly became safe. Disease, accidents, and hardship never fully disappeared, but survival stopped being a daily surprise. If you made it to adulthood, you had proven yourself remarkably resilient, even by medieval standards. It is also worth remembering that medieval people did not expect to live forever. They did not plan for retirement. They planned for continuity, passing knowledge, land, skills, and traditions to the next generation while they could. Surviving childhood did not guarantee a long life, but it unlocked the possibility of one. And in a world where survival was never promised, that possibility meant everything. You can see evidence of this in medieval records. Wills mention parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Church documents list parishioners who lived well into their 60s. Tax records show households headed by elderly farmers still working their land. These were not rare anomalies hidden in footnotes. They were common enough to appear regularly in documentation. The existence of elders shaped medieval society in practical ways. Older people held institutional memory. They remembered harvests, wars, plagues, and winters that younger generations had only heard about. This knowledge mattered when making decisions about planting, defense, or dispute resolution. What medieval life lacked was not longevity, it was consistency. Some people lived long, others did not. The difference was rarely moral or intelligent. It was circumstantial. Access to food, exposure to disease, the luck of avoiding accidents, and the burden of labor. Class played a role here, though not as decisively as you might think. Nobles ate better and worked less physically, which improved their odds. But disease did not respect titles. Plagues swept through castles just as readily as villages. Even kings died young from infections that began as minor injuries. The clergy often lived longer than both peasants and nobles. Their lives involved less physical strain, more stable food access, and communal support. Monasteries functioned as early social safety nets. Regular meals, shelter, and care during illness made a measurable difference. It turns out rest and routine are good for survival, which is not exactly shocking, but it is worth noting. Urban life sat somewhere in between. Cities offered opportunities and dangers in equal measure. Better access to trade meant better access to food, but overcrowding, waste, and poor sanitation created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Living in a city could extend your life or shorten it dramatically, depending on timing and luck. What all of this reveals is that medieval life expectancy was not a biological ceiling, it was an environmental filter. The human body was capable of living 60, 70, even 80 years. What varied was how many obstacles stood between birth and old age. Remove childhood mortality from the equation, and medieval lifespans start looking far less shocking. Adults who survived into their 50s were not miraculous outliers. They were simply the ones who had cleared enough hurdles. Scholars remain uncertain about precise average lifespans for adults who survived childhood, but estimates often place it somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 years, remarkably close to what you would expect in less developed regions today. This does not mean medieval life was easy or comfortable. It means human biology has not changed much. What has changed is the percentage of people who make it past the early filter. Ironically, this reality makes the medieval achievement more impressive, not less. Reaching old age without modern medicine, stable food supplies, or understanding of infection required extraordinary resilience and more than a little luck. The people who managed it were not superhuman. They were simply the survivors of a system that tested everyone relentlessly and let only some pass through. And when you meet references to elderly medieval people in records, complaining about taxes, arguing over land, offering advice no one asked for, you are seeing the ones who won a game most people lost early. They lived long enough to become inconvenient, opinionated, and deeply experienced, which is to say, they lived long enough to be fully human. If medieval life expectancy was already unfair, for women the difficulty setting was quietly turned up without anyone asking for consent. Women faced nearly all the same dangers as men: disease, hunger, hard labor, and accidents, and then added one more recurring threat that never took a day off: childbirth. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was not treated as a medical condition. It was treated as an inevitable life event that everyone hoped would go well. There were no ultrasounds, no emergency interventions, and no clear understanding of why things went wrong when they did. Complications were common. Outcomes were unpredictable. Optimism was mandatory. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Labor could last days. Bleeding, infection, and trauma were constant risks. If something went wrong, help was limited to midwives doing their best with experience, prayers, and whatever tools they had. Sometimes that was enough. Often it was not, and the danger did not end once the baby arrived. Post-birth infections quietly claimed lives days or weeks later. Women who seemed fine suddenly were not. Families celebrated a successful birth only to find themselves planning a funeral shortly afterward. Medieval joy had a short memory window. What made this especially cruel was repetition. Women did not face this risk once. They faced it repeatedly. Multiple pregnancies were common because survival depended on numbers. High child mortality required high birth rates. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice with the same body, already weakened by labor, malnutrition, and work. Despite this, many women lived long lives. Records show women reaching older age, managing households, working fields, raising children, and becoming central figures in family and community life. Survival did not mean ease. It meant endurance layered on top of responsibility. Men often died from violence or labor-related strain. Women often died from biology, doing what biology does with absolutely no concern for fairness. Life expectancy numbers reflect this imbalance, even if the stories behind them rarely get told. Being a woman in the Middle Ages did not guarantee a shorter life, but it guaranteed more risk. And every year survived was not just luck. It was quiet resilience in a world that demanded it constantly. The statistical impact of maternal mortality shows up clearly in medieval records. In some regions, women in their childbearing years faced mortality rates that rivaled or exceeded those of men, despite men's exposure to warfare and dangerous labor. This was not universal. Variations existed by region, class, and time period, but the pattern was consistent enough to matter. Pregnancy was a leveling force that made social class less protective than usual. A noblewoman had access to better food and more rest, but she still faced the same biological risks during labor as a peasant. Wealth could not buy safety when the fundamental problem was lack of medical knowledge. What makes this particularly striking is how normalized it was. Childbirth deaths were not treated as rare tragedies. They were expected possibilities. Wills written by pregnant women were common. Practical documents prepared just in case. Churches kept records of women who died in or shortly after childbirth with the same routine notation used for other deaths. This normalization did not mean people did not grieve. It meant grief was woven into the fabric of life so thoroughly that it became part of planning, not just responding. Women also faced the reality that each surviving child increased the household's chances of long-term survival. But each pregnancy increased their own immediate risk. This created a tension that had no good resolution. Limiting pregnancies was not really an option in a world without reliable contraception and where family size directly affected economic stability and old age security. So women continued, knowing the odds, carrying the risk, and hoping each time would go well. The emotional weight of this is difficult to capture from a distance. You are looking at a system where half the population faced a recurring, potentially fatal event as a normal part of life, not an accident, not a rare disease, but something built into the structure of existence. And yet women adapted. They supported each other through labor. Midwives accumulated knowledge across lifetimes. Communities developed rituals around birth that provided both practical help and emotional scaffolding. What medieval women did not have was choice in the modern sense, but they had resilience, networks of support, and the same stubborn determination to survive that characterized medieval life more broadly. Scholars remain uncertain about the exact proportion of maternal deaths relative to other causes of death among women, but estimates suggest that in some communities, complications from childbirth could account for a significant fraction, perhaps even a majority, of deaths among women in their 20s and 30s. This was not universal. Some women never became pregnant, some had fewer children, and some simply got lucky. But the risk was substantial enough to shape how entire communities thought about women's lives. The expectation was not that every woman would die in childbirth, but that many would, and that expectation colored everything from marriage arrangements to inheritance laws to the way women were remembered after death. When a woman lived into her 50s or beyond, having survived multiple pregnancies, it was recognized as an achievement worth noting. What this means for the larger story of medieval life expectancy is straightforward. Averages hide gender-specific risks. The age 30 number collapses, not just childhood mortality, but also the specific, recurring danger women faced during their most active years. If you separate out the data, you often find that women who survived past childbearing age had life expectancies comparable to men, sometimes even slightly better. The problem was getting there. Biology, in the absence of modern medicine, was simply more dangerous for half the population, and medieval society, for all its adaptations and resilience, had no way to fix that. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy did not just depend on luck, resilience, or avoiding suspicious fevers. It also depended heavily on something you had absolutely no control over: who you were born to. Social class quietly tilted the odds long before anyone had a chance to make good decisions. Peasants lived closer to danger, hard labor, poor nutrition, exposure to the elements, and crowded living conditions all worked together to shorten lives. If you were poor, your body absorbed the cost of survival every single day. You did not get breaks. You did not get lighter duties when injured. You worked until you could not, and then you worked some more. Injuries were common and cumulative. A twisted ankle never fully healed. A damaged shoulder became permanent. A bad fall might not kill you immediately, but it would quietly reduce everything you could do afterward. And when your body failed, your ability to survive went with it. Work did not usually kill people dramatically. It killed them slowly through exhaustion, vulnerability, and wear. A weakened body was less resistant to illness. A tired person healed poorly. An injured worker became dependent, and dependency was dangerous in a world without social safety nets. Children worked early, too, not because medieval parents were cruel, but because survival required it. By the time someone reached adulthood, Their body had already logged decades of strain. This meant that even those who lived into older age often did so with chronic pain, reduced mobility, and a deep familiarity with suffering. Craftsmen and tradespeople fared slightly better. Their work was still hard, but less punishing than full-time agricultural labor. This difference shows up in records. Some professions lived longer on average, not because they were safer, but because they were less destructive over time. Nobles lived differently. They ate better. They slept in warmer homes. They worked less physically demanding jobs. They had servants to absorb risk on their behalf. This mattered, not because nobles were smarter or stronger, but because their bodies were not constantly being worn down by survival itself. This does not mean nobles were safe. Far from it. Disease did not respect titles. Plagues happily swept through castles. Poor medical knowledge affected everyone equally, and nobles had a habit of dying in wars, tournaments, and ambitious political schemes. Privilege improved odds, not outcomes. The clergy often lived longer than both peasants and nobles. Their lives involved less physical labor, more stable food access, and communal support. Monasteries functioned as early social safety nets. Regular meals, shelter, and care during illness made a measurable difference. It turns out rest and routine are good for survival, which should not be surprising. But the contrast with other social groups makes it worth noting. Monks and nuns were not immune to disease or hardship, but their environment reduced many of the daily stressors that shortened lives elsewhere. Urban life sat somewhere in between. Cities offered opportunity and danger in equal measure. Better access to food and trade competed with overcrowding, waste, and disease. Living in a city could extend your life or shorten it dramatically, depending on timing and luck. Merchants and skilled workers in towns often had better nutrition than rural peasants, but they also lived in closer quarters where illness spread faster. The trade-off was not always favorable. Plague years hit cities especially hard, wiping out entire neighborhoods in weeks. Class did not guarantee survival. It nudged probabilities. A peasant could live long. A noble could die young. But statistically, comfort mattered. Reduced physical strain mattered. Consistent nutrition mattered. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not evenly shared. It was distributed according to burden, and the heaviest burdens were carried by those least able to avoid them. This inequality was not hidden or controversial. It was simply how the world worked. No one expected fairness. People expected hierarchy, duty, and the understanding that some lives were harder than others. What makes this especially sobering is how little agency most people had. You did not choose your social class. You were born into it, and it shaped nearly every aspect of your existence. How much you ate, how hard you worked, how warm you stayed, how long you lived. Mobility between classes was possible, but rare. Most people died in the same social position they were born into. This means that for the vast majority, survival odds were set at birth and changed little afterward. Scholars remain uncertain about the precise life expectancy differences between social classes, partly because record keeping was better for the wealthy than the poor. But archaeological evidence from skeletal remains tells a consistent story. Bodies from lower-class graves show more signs of malnutrition, repetitive strain injuries, and early onset degenerative conditions. Bodies from higher status burials show fewer of these markers, though they are not absent. The difference is one of degree, not kind. Everyone suffered. Some just suffered more. There is also the question of access to care. When a noble fell ill, physicians attended, however misguided their treatments might have been. When a peasant fell ill, they relied on family, folk remedies, and hope. This did not always favor the noble, given how enthusiastically medieval doctors practiced bloodletting, but it meant different experiences of illness and different chances of recovery. Class shaped not just whether you got sick, but what happened after. What this reveals about medieval life expectancy is uncomfortable but clear. The famous averages, those shocking numbers that suggest everyone died at 30, hide not just childhood mortality, but systematic inequality. Behind every statistic are lives shaped by forces no individual could control. Some people were born into circumstances that gave them a fighting chance. Others were born into circumstances that guaranteed a hard, short struggle. The world did not pretend otherwise. It simply continued, generation after generation, with survival distributed unevenly and without apology. So, you have made it through the statistics, the uncertainties, and the quiet inequalities that defined medieval life. You have seen how childhood was the great filter, how adulthood offered surprising longevity for those who survived, and how every factor, gender, class, labor, and sheer chance, shaped who lived and who did not. The Middle Ages were not a world of uniform short lives. They were a world where survival was hard-won, unevenly distributed, and never guaranteed. And yet people endured. They loved, worked, raised families, and passed on what they knew. The numbers hide the humanity, but the humanity was always there, stubborn and persistent, lasting just long enough to matter.